She thought he was sleeping with another woman. She followed him. She collected the evidence. She built the case. And on the night she finally confronted the most dangerous man in Chicago, the truth she uncovered didn't just break her heart. It broke every assumption she had ever made about love, sacrifice, and the secrets a man will carry alone before he lets the woman he loves watch him bleed. Stay until the end. You won't see this coming. Like this video, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels.
Dahshat.
The penthouse was quiet the way expensive things go quiet. Not peaceful, but sealed. 42 floors above Chicago's lakefront, the windows stretched floor to ceiling and the city burned amber and white beneath them, indifferent and enormous. Madeline Hart stood at the kitchen island in bare feet, her second glass of Cabernet untouched on the marble counter, watching the clock on the microwave tick past 11:15. Damien wasn't home. That wasn't the problem. Damien Blackwood kept hours that defied any reasonable schedule, always had, from the first week she'd known him. That was 4 years ago, at a fundraiser gala she'd organized for a children's hospital on the North Side. She'd been the event designer, moving through the crowd with a wireless earpiece and a clipboard, too busy to be impressed by anyone. He'd stopped her near the coat check and said, "You're the only person in this room who actually looks like they have somewhere to be." She'd told him to move out of the way of the fire exit. He'd laughed, a real laugh, not a performance, and something in her chest had shifted without her permission. 4 years. An engagement ring for 14 months. A life assembled in this penthouse like a careful argument. Her touches alongside his, her photography books on his shelves, her spare set of heels by the elevator because she'd given up trying to keep things in their separate compartments. She loved him. She had chosen him with her eyes open, knowing what he was. Damien Blackwood didn't hide what he was. Not exactly. The suits, the cars, the men who materialized at restaurant entrances to open doors and disappear again, none of that was a secret. Chicago knew his name. Certain circles knew it with a kind of low-frequency dread. Madeline had made her peace with the edges of his world a long time ago, not because she was naive, but because she'd watched him closely enough to believe in the man beneath the architecture of power. She'd seen him on ordinary Tuesday mornings, barefoot in the kitchen making coffee he always burned, reading the Tribune with his glasses on because he refused to admit he needed them for small print. She'd watched him sit with an elderly neighbor in their building lobby for 40 minutes after the woman's husband died, just listening, not because anyone was watching, but because that's what he did when he thought no one was paying attention. She knew him. At least she had believed that. The changes had started in, she'd counted backward enough times to be certain, late February. Small things at first, the kind that register somewhere beneath conscious thought, and only surface later when you line them up. He started taking his phone to the bathroom. Not every night, but enough. He'd always been protective of his phone. That came with the territory. But this was different. This was careful in a way that had a texture she could feel. Then the calls. She'd walk into a room and he'd lower his voice or step out onto the terrace, the glass door sliding shut behind him. She'd catch fragments, numbers, places, once what sounded like a name, and he'd come back in wearing the expression she was learning to dread. Closed, composed, offering nothing, the withdrawals. She hadn't gone looking. She'd seen a bank notification on his tablet when she'd picked it up to check the weather. $40,000, cash. A week later, another one. She told herself there were explanations. There were always explanations with a man like Damien. She'd told herself she wasn't the kind of woman who monitored her partner's finances. She'd poured herself a drink and gone to bed and stared at the ceiling until 3 a.m. The absences multiplied. He'd leave in the middle of the night, dressed not in the clothes of a man going to handle business, but in something quieter. Dark jeans, plain jacket, no watch. He'd come back in the early hours with a face so stripped of expression it frightened her more than anger would have. He wouldn't explain. She'd ask, carefully at first, and he'd say nothing for you to worry about with a finality that was meant to be reassuring and landed instead like a door closing in her face. She was a woman who built things for a living. Events, atmospheres, experiences assembled from 1,000 moving parts into something seamless. She understood structure. She understood when something was being concealed inside a structure that was meant to look intact. By mid-March, she had started, quietly, and without a name for what she was doing, to pay attention in a different way. She noticed the contact labeled simply M that appeared in his recent calls with a frequency that made her stomach tighten. Not every day, but every few days, sometimes twice in a single evening. Short calls, 15 minutes, 20. He never mentioned them. She never asked because she was afraid, not of the question, but of having to hear an answer she couldn't unknow. Her friend Kara, over wine on a Thursday night while Damien was out doing whatever Damien was doing, had not been gentle about it. Madeline. Kara set down her glass and looked at her with the particular directness of a woman who had been divorced twice and earned the right to call things by their names. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because you're sitting here explaining away a man who's hiding his phone, disappearing at midnight, moving serious cash, and you're talking about it like you're filing a police report. At some point, you have to ask yourself what you're protecting. I trust him. You trusted him. Past tense is doing a lot of work in that sentence right now. Madeline had driven home with Kara's voice following her the whole way up Lakeshore Drive. She'd sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes before going upstairs. Damien had been home that night, already in bed, and she'd lain beside him in the dark, listening to him breathe and trying to locate the man she knew inside the stillness of him. She couldn't find him. That was the night something shifted from worry into something harder. Not anger yet, something more like resolution. She was going to understand what was happening. She was going to do it quietly, without accusation, without blowing the whole structure apart on a suspicion she couldn't yet name. She was a careful woman. She would be careful about this. It took her 3 days to find the building. She hadn't planned it the way it sounds. She'd been in his home office, legitimately, looking for the folder of vendor contracts she'd left there 2 weeks ago, and she'd seen the notepad on his desk. Damien had a habit, when he was on the phone, of pressing hard with a pen even when he wasn't writing anything down, dragging it in slow lines while he listened. She'd taken the notepad back to the kitchen light and angled it until she could read the impressions. An address on North Michigan. A time. Tuesday, 4 p.m. Tuesday was 2 days away. She told herself she wasn't going to go. She made coffee and answered emails and called a florist about an installation she had scheduled for the following weekend and told herself very firmly that she was not the kind of woman who followed her fiancé across the city because she'd read a ghost address from a notepad. She went. She parked half a block north and watched him walk through the lobby entrance of a glass and steel building she didn't recognize. Clean lines, understated signage, medical. She didn't know how she knew immediately, but she did. There was something about the way people moved in and out of that building, slower, more deliberate. The weight of something unsaid in how they held their shoulders. She sat in the car for an hour and 40 minutes. He came out alone, his jaw set, his hands in his jacket pockets. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment before his driver pulled up, and in that moment, just that moment, she saw his face without the guard up. He looked hollowed out. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something for a very long time and had just put it down briefly and couldn't quite remember how to stand without the weight. She drove home before he did and was in the kitchen when he came through the door and said nothing about where he'd been. She said nothing either. She started sleeping badly. Not dramatically. She wasn't lying awake weeping or catastrophizing in loops. It was subtler and worse than that. She'd wake at 3 or 4 in the morning into a flat, clear alertness that had no edge to it, no panic, just a cold certainty that she was missing something important and running out of time to figure out what it was. She went back to the building on Michigan the following Friday morning, early enough that the sun was still low and the city smelled like pavement and coffee. She sat across the street at a cafe and nursed a black coffee for 90 minutes. She watched who went in. She looked at the directory listing on her phone. The building housed 3 separate medical practices and a specialty center for hematology and blood disorders. She didn't know what to do with that. Her investigation, if she could call it that, was a civilian's investigation. Incomplete, emotional, threaded through with interpretations she kept trying to correct for. She wrote things down in the Notes app on her phone and deleted them and wrote them again. She called her sister once, started to explain, and couldn't find a way to say it that didn't sound like she was building a case against a man she still loved without reservation. Because she did still love him. That was the most brutal part. Every suspicion she turned over in her mind was contaminated by that. She'd look at him across the dinner table. Those evenings when he was home, when they sat together and talked about ordinary things, the city, her work, a book he'd been reading. And she'd feel it, undiminished and inconvenient, the specific way he held a fork, the way he listened with his whole face, the way he reached across the table sometimes and pressed his thumb against her knuckles for exactly a second before pulling back, a reflex he probably wasn't conscious of. She didn't want to be right about what she feared, but she needed to know. The security footage was an accident, not illegal. She hadn't broken into anything, hadn't hired anyone, hadn't placed a device. Their building's internal camera system, the private residential network that covered the common areas and had a secondary monitor in the management office, was something Damien himself had given her access to 18 months ago after a break-in on the floor below them. "In case I'm traveling and you want to see the lobby," he'd said, setting up the app on her phone. She'd used it twice and forgotten about it. She remembered it on a Wednesday evening in early April when she was getting ready for a client dinner she was dreading, and Damien said he had something to take care of and would be late. She watched him walk out of the frame of the front door camera from her Uber on the way across town. She watched the footage from their floor. Not to spy, she told herself, just to see, just to have a record of something, though she couldn't have said exactly what she was documenting or why. She came home at 10:30 to an empty penthouse. She poured a glass of water and sat on the couch and opened the app. She went backward through the footage, lobby footage, hallway footage, and then she found it. Earlier that evening, before Damien had left, there was a 40-minute gap she hadn't been conscious of during which he'd been in his private office. The camera didn't cover the office interior, but there was an angle, a secondary angle from the hallway camera aimed at the office door, that caught, through the frosted glass panel beside the door, a faint ambient image. Not enough to see him clearly, enough to see his shape. He was on the phone for most of it. She could tell by the stillness of him, then by the movement. He stood, sat, stood again. And then she had to lean close to the phone screen to be sure she was seeing what she was seeing. He stopped moving. He sat down behind the desk and put his face in his hands. She watched him cry. She had never seen Damien Blackwood cry. In 4 years, through 3 separate crises that would have leveled most people, she had never seen him break like that. And here he was, alone in his office, while she was across town sipping wine she didn't want, and he was in pieces. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time. When he came home at midnight, she was still on the couch. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, recalibrating. She could see him do it, the fraction of a second adjustment he made whenever reality deviated from what he'd prepared for. "You're up late," he said. "Couldn't sleep." He came and sat beside her, close, but not touching. He smelled like cold air and something antiseptic she couldn't name. He looked at the blank television screen and said nothing. She wanted to ask him what was wrong. She wanted to say, "I saw you. I saw what you looked like in there alone, and I need you to let me in." She wanted to tell him that whatever it was, they could handle it together, that she wasn't made of glass, that the relationship they had was supposed to be built for exactly this. She said none of it. She said, "Long night?" "Yeah." "You should sleep." "In a minute." He sat there for another 10 minutes, and she sat beside him, and neither of them said the things that needed to be said. Then he stood, touched her shoulder once, that same reflex, thumb to bone, a second, and then gone, and went to bed. She stayed on the couch and stared at the city through the windows and understood, somewhere beneath the fear and the suspicion and the love she couldn't reason her way out of, that they were in trouble. Not the kind of trouble she'd been imagining, something different, something she didn't have the right shape for yet. 3 days later, she found the name. She hadn't been going through his phone. She needed to be precise about this, because the distinction mattered to her, even if it would have mattered to no one else. She'd been walking past the kitchen island, and his phone had been there, screen lit from a notification, and the name had been right there in plain sight before she could look away. Charlotte. 9:47 p.m. Missed. She kept walking. She went to the bathroom and ran cold water over her wrists, a habit she'd had since college when anxiety made her body feel too warm. She stood there with the water running and turned the name over in her mind. Charlotte. It wasn't a name she knew from his life. In 4 years, he had never mentioned a Charlotte. She knew his business associates, his attorney, the men who worked under him, a handful of people he called friends in the specific, careful way he called anything. There was no Charlotte. She went back to her laptop and started over. She built it differently this time, not from fear, not from the formless dread of an unnamed threat, but from the clean-line discipline of a woman who understood that information had to be assembled before it could be interpreted. She spent 2 days sitting with what she knew: the building on Michigan, hematology, the cash, the calls to M, which she now wondered if she'd misread, if the contact name had been longer than she'd registered, the footage of a man she loved weeping alone in his office, the name Charlotte surfacing from a missed call at 9:47 on a Tuesday night. She could feel the shape of something. She couldn't see it yet. And then, on a Thursday night, she got close enough to see. She'd followed him. She wasn't proud of it. She'd stood at the penthouse window and watched his car pull away from the building and made a decision in about 4 seconds that she could either keep waiting or she could move. She took the elevator to the parking level and followed at a distance she thought was safe, the way she'd seen it done in movies, and immediately felt absurd about, because this was her life, not a movie, and the man 2 cars ahead of her was the man she was supposed to marry. He went to the building on Michigan, but not the entrance she'd seen before. He went around to a side entrance, quieter, and met a woman in a white coat at the door, young, professional, carrying a tablet. They spoke briefly and went inside. Madeline sat in the car in the yellow sodium light of the parking structure entrance and felt something break loose in her chest, a small, clean break, the kind that doesn't hurt until later. A woman. A private entrance. A building full of specialists. She drove home and called Kara and sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the island and said, "I think I've been wrong about what kind of problem this is." "What do you mean?" I thought it was someone else. Another woman. Simple. Terrible, but simple." She pressed her palm flat against the cold tile. "I don't think that's what this is." "Madeline. There's a name, Charlotte, and there's a specialty medical center. And Kara, you should have seen his face when he didn't know I was watching. He wasn't. Men who are having affairs don't look like that. They don't look like they're drowning." The silence on the other end stretched long enough to be its own kind of answer. "What are you going to do?" Madeline looked up at the ceiling of the kitchen she'd spent 4 years making her own, the copper pots she'd hung herself, the photograph she'd taken of the lake at sunrise, framed above the window, the life they'd assembled together, its seams and its beauty all equally visible to her because she'd been present for the making of it. "I'm going to ask him," she said, "tonight." She waited for him the way she had that first night, at the counter, the wine untouched, the city burning below. But this time she was calm in a way that felt different from before. Not numb, not resigned, clear. He came in at 11:40. He stopped when he saw her face. "Sit down," she said. He didn't move. "Damien." She kept her voice even. "Sit down, please." He crossed the kitchen slowly and sat at the island across from her. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, something between braced and defeated. The look of a man who has been waiting for a particular door to open and can't decide whether he wants it to or not. She said, "Who is Charlotte?" The way his face changed was its own answer. Not guilt, not the hot flash of a caught man, but something older and heavier. A muscle in his jaw pulled tight. He looked down at his hands on the counter. "Damien, I need you to tell me what's happening." He looked up. "It's not what you think," he said. "Then tell me what it is. Because I have been standing in this apartment for 2 months watching you come apart in slow motion, and I have been building theories, and I need you to tell me I'm wrong. I need you to tell me there's a reason for all of it that I haven't been able to see." He was quiet for a moment that stretched until she thought she couldn't hold the silence anymore. Then he said, "Her name is Charlotte Blackwood." Madeline felt the air change. "She's my sister." The word landed in the room like something physical. Madeline stared at him. In 4 years he had never, not once, mentioned a sister. She had believed him to be without family. He'd said as much early on. "It's just me." She'd accepted it the way she'd accepted many things about him, as a closed door she respected without needing to open. "You have a sister," she said. It wasn't a question. It was something she was saying out loud in order to make it real. Had. His voice cracked on the word, and he stopped. He looked at the counter. "Have. She's sick, Madeline." The whole picture didn't fall into place yet. Not quite. But she could see the edges of it now, the shape of it, and it was so much larger and more terrible than what she had been imagining that she felt something like vertigo, the floor shifting, her understanding of the last 2 months reorganizing itself around this single point. "How sick?" she asked. He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he almost never let himself. And what she saw in his face was the thing she'd glimpsed through the frosted glass of his office door. A man at the absolute limit of what he could carry alone. "Sick enough," he said, "that I've been terrified to tell you." And that was the moment. The look on his face, the fracture in his voice, the 4 years of trust and love and imperfect ordinary life stacked behind them. That was the moment Madeline Hart understood she had been investigating the wrong crime entirely. The secret Damien Blackwood had been keeping wasn't a betrayal. It was a grief he had been trying to carry so she wouldn't have to. She reached across the counter and covered his hand with hers. "Tell me everything," she said. He opened his mouth, and then his phone rang. The screen lit on the counter between them. Dr. Raines, 11:52 p.m. And the look that crossed Damien's face turned the room cold. He picked it up. He listened for 10 seconds. His hand gripped the phone tightly enough that she could see the tension move up through his wrist, his forearm, his shoulder. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, and ended the call. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I have to go," he said. "Damien, Madeline." He was already standing, already reaching for his jacket. "I will tell you everything, I promise you. But right now, is she alive?" The question came out before she could shape it into anything careful. He stopped, just for a second. "She's alive," he said, "but it's close." He was gone before she could ask anything else. The elevator doors closed, and she stood in the kitchen with his words still in the air, and the city below them still burning. And everything she thought she knew about the last 2 months transformed into something she hadn't been prepared for. She looked at his empty chair. She looked at the phone he'd left behind on the counter in his rush. Not his primary phone. A second one. A cheap prepaid thing she'd never seen before. It sat there between them, its screen dark. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked it up. The phone was lighter than she expected. That was the first thing Madeline registered. The specific weight of it in her palm, or the lack of weight, the way it sat there like something disposable. Which was the point, she understood. A prepaid phone. Untraceable. The kind of object that existed specifically so that conversations couldn't be recovered, so that a record couldn't be built. She knew this because she had spent 2 months learning to read the architecture of concealment, and here was another piece of it. Sitting in her kitchen at midnight while her fiancé drove through the city toward a hospital she still didn't know the name of. She set the phone back down. She stepped away from the counter and pressed both hands flat against the kitchen window, cold glass against her palms, and looked at the city below without seeing it. Her breath fogged the glass in a small circle that appeared and disappeared. A sister. Charlotte Blackwood. She turned it over and over, the way you turn a stone in your hand looking for the place where it cuts. 4 years. She had known this man for 4 years, had lived alongside him, had built a future with him in the specific, deliberate way that 2 people do when they mean it. And he had never, not once, mentioned that he had a sister. She tried to find the moment he might have referenced family and come close. She couldn't find it. He'd sealed that room shut and handed her the key to every other room in his life, and she had never thought to ask about the one that stayed locked. She went to the couch. She sat. She did not turn on a light. She's alive. But it's close. The words kept arriving. She'd replay the look on his face when the phone rang. Not surprise, not the controlled neutrality he wore as a default, but something beneath both of those things. Something raw and animal. Fear, she thought. Pure unmedicated fear, the kind that doesn't care what it looks like. She had seen him negotiate with men who carried weapons. She had seen him absorb news that would have shattered most people without blinking. She had watched him walk into rooms that went quiet when he entered and come out the other side without changing the rhythm of his breathing. She had never seen him afraid. Until tonight. She didn't sleep. She sat in the dark and tried to assemble everything into something she could hold. The building on Michigan. A hematology center. Blood disorders. Charlotte. Months of disappearances and cash and closed doors, and underneath all of it, a dying sister that no one knew he had. She thought about the footage she'd watched through the frosted glass. His shape behind the desk, face in his hands. She understood it differently now, and the understanding didn't make it easier. It made it heavier. Because a man weeping over a betrayal was something she knew how to place in the world. A man weeping alone in the dark because his sister was dying and he couldn't tell the woman he loved, that was something else. That had a texture she wasn't prepared for. He came back at 4:17 in the morning. She heard the elevator. She heard his key. She heard him stop just inside the door when he registered the dark, the silence, her shape on the couch. "You stayed up," he said. "Yes." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, not beside her. The distance felt deliberate, not cold but careful, the way you move around something fragile. He was still wearing his jacket. His hands rested on his knees. He looked like he hadn't slept in longer than one night. "Is she okay?" Madeline asked. "Stable. For now." He paused. Her counts dropped. They got it under control. "What is it? The disorder?" He was quiet for a moment. "It's called aplastic anemia. Her bone marrow stopped producing enough blood cells. It's serious. It's been serious since November." November. She registered that without speaking. November, which meant he had been carrying this for 5 months. 5 months of the absences and the cash and the sealed face, and all of it feeding backward into their life together like water into a foundation crack, slow and invisible, until the damage was structural. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. She kept her voice flat. Not because she wasn't feeling it. She was feeling it enormously. But because she needed the conversation to stay functional. She needed information more than she needed to express what was moving through her. Damien looked at his hands. I didn't know how to. He stopped. Started again. "She asked me not to tell anyone. She's private. She didn't want people knowing. I'm not people, Damien. I know that. I'm the woman you're supposed to marry." "I know that too." He met her eyes. "I thought I could handle it without pulling you into it. I thought if I could get ahead of it, if I could find a donor, get the right doctors, get her through treatment, I could tell you afterward, when it wasn't terrifying anymore." She looked at him for a long time. He held the look without flinching, which was the most Damien thing he'd done all evening, and she felt beneath the shock and the grief and the very specific anger of a woman who has been protected from the truth by the man who should have trusted her with it. She felt the love, unbroken, still there, inconveniently alive. "You have a sister," she said again. "I have a sister," he said. "Tell me about her." Something moved across his face. It wasn't what she expected. It wasn't relief, wasn't the release of a burden set down. It was more cautious than that, more careful, like a man deciding, in real time, whether to open a door he'd kept shut for a very long time. "She's 26, he said. "She grew up with our mother in Evanston. We have different fathers. I didn't know about her until she was 18. She found me. She reached out through a lawyer." He paused. I wasn't easy about it at first. I had a whole architecture of thinking about family, and she didn't fit into it. But she's persistent. She showed up at a restaurant I was at, sat down across from me, and said, "I didn't come to ask you for anything. I just wanted to see if you were real." Madeline watched his face as he talked. The guard wasn't up. She didn't think he'd made a decision to lower it. She thought it had simply given way under the accumulated weight of 5 months and one very long night. "We built something," he said. "Slowly. Over about 3 years. We're not close the way you'd imagine. But she's mine. She's the only..." He stopped. His jaw worked. "She's the only family I have left." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. "Why the secrecy?" Madeline asked. "With me specifically. Why keep it from me?" He looked out the window. "Because bringing you into my world was already cost you things. Things you don't complain about, but I know. The security. The limitations on where you can go and who knows you're with me. The way certain events get complicated. The way people look at you sometimes when they figure out who you're connected to." He looked back at her. "I made a choice when I fell in love with you that I was going to protect you from as much of the weight as I could. Charlotte being sick, That's my weight to carry. I didn't want to put it on you. That's not your decision to make. I know. I am a grown woman, Damien. I am the woman who stood next to you in a courthouse 3 years ago when Falcone's people were making threats on your life, and I did not move. I did not leave. I have never once. I know. His voice was quiet. I know that. It wasn't a judgment about whether you could handle it. It was... He paused, and she saw him struggle with the word, the right word, the honest one. It was selfishness. I needed one part of my life that wasn't in crisis. I needed to come home to you and have you not look at me with the same fear that's in every doctor's office I walk into. I needed that. I know it wasn't fair. She sat with that. It landed differently than she expected. Not as an excuse, but as a confession, and there was a distinction that mattered. She breathed through it. I thought you were having an affair, she said. He went still. I thought the calls, the money, the disappearances, I thought it was another woman. She said it evenly. Not to wound him, but because the truth of the last 2 months deserved to be in the room. I built a whole case in my head. I followed you. I found the building on Michigan. I've been sitting with that conviction for weeks, Damien, and tonight was supposed to be the night I confronted you with it. He was staring at her. Instead, you get a midnight phone call and leave before I can ask you the second question. She exhaled. And I picked up the phone you left on the counter. Something shifted in his expression. The second phone. Yes. Madeline? I didn't read it. I held it for about 30 seconds and put it down. She paused. But I want to know what's on it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and set his primary phone on the table between them. He unlocked it. He turned it toward her and said, "Ask me anything you want to see." She looked at the phone. She looked at him. She didn't pick it up. "I don't want to check your phone," she said. "I want you to talk to me. I want you to stop making decisions about what I can handle and start treating me like your partner." He nodded. Once. Slow. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she repeated. They sat in the dark for another hour. He talked, haltingly at first, then with more continuity, the way a river finds its course once you stop trying to dam it. He told her about Charlotte's first symptoms in October, the fatigue she'd attributed to work stress, the diagnosis in November, 2 days before Thanksgiving, the first specialist, then a second one, then a third because the second one was too conservative and the third had the best outcomes data in the Midwest. He told her about the donor search, which had been ongoing for 4 months and had come back empty twice. He told her about the experimental protocol Charlotte's primary physician had proposed, expensive, uncertain, and the best option they had. He told her about the $230,000 he'd moved in the last 5 months, which was a number that hit Madeline somewhere specific and stayed there. She listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. She let him finish. When he was done, the sky outside had gone from black to the particular deep blue that precedes dawn, and she was exhausted in a way that went past the body into something cellular. "I need to sleep," she said. "Yeah. We're not done. There's a lot more to say. I know. But I need to sleep first." She stood. He stood. They looked at each other in the near dark of the living room with the city going gray behind him, and she felt the whole of the last 2 months sitting between them like a physical object. All the misinterpretation and fear and the careful, terrible distance they'd maintained while standing in the same rooms. She crossed the space between them and put her arms around him. He went rigid for a half second. Surprise, she thought, or the specific startle of a man who had been braced for a different kind of contact. Then he put his arms around her and held on with a force that confirmed everything she'd suspected about how long he'd been carrying this without anyone to put it down with. She felt his breath against her temple, slow and controlled, but at the edges of it something ragged. "We're okay," she said. "We're going to be okay. But no more of this. No more," he said. She believed him. She went to bed and slept for 5 hours and woke with the particular bright-headed clarity that sometimes follows an emotional night, when the body has processed what the mind was too tired to handle. She lay still for a few minutes and listened to the city and thought about Charlotte Blackwood, 26 years old and persistent enough to sit down across from her brother in a restaurant and demand to know if he was real. She thought she might like her. She got up, Damien was already in the kitchen, coffee made, the paper on the counter. He looked up when she came in. He'd slept, barely, she could tell by the shadows under his eyes. But he'd showered and changed, and he looked like himself again, which was both a relief and, in a small buried way, a frustration she noted and filed away. "I want to meet her," Madeline said. He set down his coffee cup. "Madeline, don't." She held up one hand. "Don't manage this. Don't decide it's not the right time or she's not ready or you want to wait until she's stronger. I want to meet your sister. That's not a negotiable request." He looked at her for a long moment. "She's going to want to know why she's meeting you now." "Tell her the truth. You should try that." The corner of his mouth moved, almost. "I'll call her today," he said. "Good." She poured herself coffee and sat across from him, and they ate breakfast in a quiet that felt different from all the previous quiet. Not sealed, not defended, but functional. Working quiet. The kind that two people share when they are in the same problem and have agreed, without saying so explicitly, to face it from the same side. 2 days later, she met Charlotte. The hospital room was smaller than she'd expected for the caliber of facility it was in. Clean, precise, the kind of organized medical space that spoke of expense without decoration. Charlotte Blackwood was sitting up in bed with a tablet in her lap and an expression that assessed Madeline in the first 2 seconds and didn't bother disguising it. She was slight, dark-haired like her brother, but with their mother's coloring in the warmth of her skin. There was something about her face that was already familiar. Not a resemblance to Damien exactly, but a quality, the same directness in the eyes, the same economy of expression. She looked sick. She also looked like someone who resented looking sick, which told Madeline something useful. "So you're the fiancé," Charlotte said. "I am." "He finally told you." "He did." Charlotte glanced at her brother, who was standing just inside the door with his hands in his pockets. "What took you so long?" Damien said nothing, which was, Madeline was learning, often his most honest answer. Charlotte looked back at Madeline. "Are you angry with him?" "Yes," Madeline said. Charlotte tilted her head slightly, reevaluating. "Good. He needs people who tell him the truth." She gestured toward the chair beside her bed. "Sit down. He hovers less when there's someone else in the room." Madeline sat. Damien remained by the door, which seemed to be a compromise they'd both accepted. The visit lasted an hour. Madeline learned more about Charlotte Blackwood in that hour than she'd learned about Damien in the first 3 months of knowing him. She was an architect. She'd been practicing for 2 years. She'd been dealing with the fatigue and the diagnosis while still going into work 3 days a week until her hematologist had essentially forbidden it. She talked about her illness the way she talked about a construction delay, a problem with a timeline, obstinate and inconvenient and ultimately solvable if you found the right approach. Madeline recognized this as a form of courage that was also a form of armor, and she recognized it because she'd been wearing the same kind for the last 2 months. "He's been impossible," Charlotte said, with a sideways look at her brother. "He thinks money fixes everything. He hired 3 doctors in 1 week." "That's not inaccurate," Damien said from the door. "I have a primary physician. I don't need a committee." "Your primary physician is thorough. He's not aggressive enough." "He's aggressive enough. Dr. Raines has better outcomes data. I am not a data point, Damien." The dynamic between them was something Madeline watched with a kind of quiet fascination. Not siblings who had grown up together without the layered shorthand of shared childhood, but something they'd built on their own terms. It had friction in it. It also had something real. When visiting hours ended, she walked with Damien to the parking structure in silence. He opened her car door and she stood beside it for a moment instead of getting in. "She's remarkable," she said. "Yes." His voice was flat, but she'd learned to read the register below the flat. "She's going to be okay." "We don't know that yet." "She's going to be okay," Madeline said again, not as reassurance, as a position she was taking. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. The same shift she'd caught through frosted glass, but visible now, not hidden. He was exhausted. He was terrified. He was in love with his sister the way that people who find family late love fiercely and without the buffer of familiarity to soften it. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "Yes." "I'm sorry." "I know." She got in the car. He walked to his. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel before starting the engine, and she thought, they were past the worst of it. They were on the other side of the secret now, standing in the open, and it was painful, and it was real, and it was manageable. They could work with real. They could build something from here. She thought that. She was wrong. 2 weeks later, she found the second set of records. She hadn't been looking for them. She'd been in Damien's office searching for a client contract she'd sent to the printer there, legitimately, routinely, and the drawer she opened was the wrong drawer, and what she pulled out thinking it was her folder was not her folder, but a manila envelope with a medical center letterhead. She set it on the desk. She looked at it. She opened it. It was a financial summary. She could see that immediately. Columns and figures, dates and amounts. But it wasn't Charlotte's treatment costs. The patient name on the header wasn't Charlotte Blackwood. She had to read it twice to be sure, because the name she was reading didn't fit into any framework she currently had. The patient name was Renata Voss, and the amounts were larger than anything she'd seen in Charlotte's file. And the dates went back further, back to September, 2 months before Charlotte's diagnosis. She stood in Damien's office with the document in her hands and the city flat and gray through the window behind her, and felt the ground she'd thought was solid begin, very quietly, to shift beneath her feet. She read the document a third time, then a fourth. The columns didn't change, the name didn't change. Renata Voss, typed cleanly in the patient header field of a financial summary from the same specialty medical center where Charlotte was being treated, and the amounts beneath it were not the careful, targeted expenditures of a man managing his sister's care. They were larger, more fragmented, the kind of financial pattern that suggested not one treatment protocol, but several, consultations, transfers, something labeled simply private arrangement with a figure beside it that made her breath go shallow. $312,000 between September and January. Charlotte's diagnosis had come in November. She set the document on the desk. She pressed her fingertips against the edge of it and looked at her own hands. Steady. She noted that they were steady and wasn't sure if that was strength or shock. Renata Voss. She said the name aloud in the empty office, quietly, the way you test a word in a foreign language to hear if it sounds the way it looks. It didn't mean anything to her. It wasn't a name from his business world. She'd absorbed enough of the peripheral landscape of his operation over 4 years to recognize the recurring names, the attorneys, the men who ran logistics, the contacts whose identities were described to her in general terms and left there. Renata Voss appeared in none of that architecture. She took a photograph of the document with her phone. She put it back in the envelope exactly as she'd found it. She replaced the envelope in the drawer. She found her client contract in the adjacent folder, picked it up, and walked out of the office with the same measured pace she'd walked in with, because she had learned from years of running events where everything could go wrong, and the only asset you had was your own composure, that the moment you let your body show what your mind is doing, you lose the advantage of knowing. She did not call Kara. She did not call her sister. She sat in the kitchen with her laptop and the photograph open on her phone, and she searched the name. Renata Voss was not difficult to find. That was the first thing that surprised her. She'd half expected the name to vanish into the particular opacity that surrounded certain people in Damien's world, the deliberate absence of digital footprint that characterized anyone who didn't want to be known. But Renata Voss was findable. Findable and specific, and once Madeline assembled the pieces, recognizable in a way that sent a cold current through her from the sternum down. Renata Voss was 41 years old. She was the former financial director of a private equity operation based in Milwaukee that had 3 years ago restructured under circumstances that several business publications had described in careful, legally vetted language as controversial. She had a LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in 14 months. She had a professional photograph in which she was attractive in an angular, deliberate way. Dark hair cut close, a suit that said, "I know exactly what I'm doing," and she had, in the photograph's background, barely visible but there if you were looking for it, a view of Lake Michigan that Madeline recognized from a specific angle available only from a specific set of buildings on the northern lakefront. She stared at the photograph for a long time. She thought about all the ways this could be innocent. She was disciplined enough to run through them systematically. A business associate with a medical crisis, a contact whose treatment Damien had agreed to fund for reasons that were professional rather than personal. A financial arrangement that looked strange in isolation but made sense in context. She was disciplined enough to hold those possibilities open. She was also honest enough to feel the weight of what her body already knew. She waited for him to come home. He came in at 7. Not late. A normal hour, which in the current climate of her awareness felt almost more alarming than absence would have. She was in the kitchen, dinner on the counter, everything arranged with a normality she'd manufactured because she needed to see his face when he walked in without any warning in the environment to change it. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her face. She had not been able to keep it entirely out of her face. She'd tried. The pause he made in the doorway, a fraction of a second, a small recalibration, told her what she already knew. He was reading her the way he always read her, and he was getting information. "What happened?" he said. "Close the door." He closed it. He didn't move further into the apartment. He stood just inside with his jacket still on, watching her, and she could see him running through possibilities. The same process she'd been running all afternoon, except his inventory was complete and hers had a gap in it shaped exactly like Renata Voss. "Who is Renata Voss?" she asked. The name landed. She watched it land. His face didn't collapse. It was Damien. His face didn't collapse. But something in it tightened and then went very still in a way that was worse than collapse, because it was the stillness of a man choosing, in real time, how much to give. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. "That's not an answer." "Madeline's—" "I found the file, Damien." She kept her voice even. She'd been rehearsing this for 4 hours, and the rehearsal was the only thing holding the even in her voice right now. "The financial summary, in your desk. Renata Voss, $312,000, dating back to September, before Charlotte was even diagnosed." He crossed the room slowly and sat at the kitchen island. He didn't take his jacket off. He put both hands flat on the counter and looked at them. "Tell me," she said. "She's not—" He stopped. Started again. "She's not what you think. I need you to tell me what I think, because right now I am standing here building a picture out of pieces, and I need you to tell me I have it wrong. That's all I'm asking. Tell me I have it wrong." He looked up at her. "It's complicated." The word landed like a match on dry paper. "Complicated." She said it back at him without inflection. "You hid your sister for 4 years. You spent 5 months lying to me about where you were going and what you were doing. You let me believe you were having an affair while I was falling apart trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. And now there is a woman's name on a financial document with a dollar amount attached to it that is larger than most people's annual salary. And you're sitting in my kitchen telling me it's complicated. It is complicated." His voice didn't rise. It stayed exactly level, which was its own kind of answer, because Damien's voice only stayed that level when he was controlling something with significant effort. "Then uncomplicate it," she said. "Right now, in this kitchen. You uncomplicate it for me, or I walk out of this apartment tonight and I don't come back." She meant it. She heard herself mean it in the way the words left her body. Not performed, not strategic, but real. The way ultimatums are only real when the person issuing them has already done the math on what follows. He heard it too. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Renata Voss is Charlotte's biological mother." The kitchen reorganized itself around that sentence. Madeline stood very still. "Charlotte was adopted," Damien said. "Not formally. There was no legal process. Renata gave her up at birth. Private arrangement through a mutual contact. Charlotte was raised by a woman named Helen Park, who Charlotte has always called her mother, who died 4 years ago." He paused. Renata knew Charlotte existed. Charlotte didn't know Renata existed until last year, when she got the diagnosis and the doctors started talking about genetic compatibility for a donor match. "She found her biological mother," Madeline said. "Charlotte found out Renata existed through the medical records. She came to me. She didn't want to approach Renata alone, and she didn't— Charlotte doesn't ask for things easily. Asking me was already—" He paused. "It cost her something. So you helped. I reached out to Renata on Charlotte's behalf. She'd had her own health crisis. She'd been through treatment for a cardiac condition the previous year, and she was in serious financial difficulty because of it. The equity firm she'd been with had dissolved, and she'd lost her position, and she was—" He stopped. "The money wasn't payment for agreeing to be tested as a donor. I need you to understand that. It was not transactional. It was— "It was what?" It was making it possible for her to afford to help. His voice had a careful precision to it that told her he'd thought about how to say this many times. The testing, the travel, the time off work she didn't have anymore. And once we found out she wasn't a match, I kept the arrangement because Charlotte wanted to maintain contact. Because Charlotte had found, in the middle of the worst thing she'd ever been through, a piece of her own history. And I wasn't going to put a price on that for her. Madeline listened to all of it. She stood at the counter and absorbed it sentence by sentence and felt the picture shift again, the same vertiginous shift as when he'd first said, "She's my sister," the ground moving beneath an assumption she'd built her weight on. It was not what she'd feared. She knew that. She could feel it in the specific way the tension in her chest was already changing shape. Not dissolving, not yet, but altering. This was not a betrayal of the kind she'd been braced for. It was another secret, another room in the house of his life that he'd kept locked. But the room contained something painful and protective rather than something corrosive. And yet, "You kept this from me too," she said. "Even after you told me about Charlotte. Even after I sat with you in the dark and you promised me no more. You told me everything. You said that, and you left this out." He held her look. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I knew how it would look." His voice was quiet. "A woman, money, months of transactions. I knew if you found it without context. I did find it without context. I know, because you didn't give it to me. I know." He exhaled through his nose. "I was going to tell you. When Charlotte's situation resolved one way or the other, I was going to—" "Stop." She held up one hand. "Stop finishing that sentence. You were going to tell me when it was convenient, when it was already over. When you'd managed it to the point where the dangerous parts were handled and you could present me with a clean version." Her voice had gone quiet too, which was more frightening to her than if it had risen. "That's not the same as telling me. That's narrating to me. There's a difference and you know it." He said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. She moved away from the counter. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him and looked at the lake, flat and dark under the April sky. She breathed, counted the breaths the way her therapist had taught her years ago, a technique she hadn't needed in so long she'd forgotten she still knew it. 4 in, hold 4, 4 out. Behind her, she heard him stand. She heard him cross toward her. "Don't," she said without turning. He stopped. She turned herself slowly and looked at him from across the room. In the low light of the kitchen at 7:15 on a Wednesday evening, he looked like what he was. A man who had been running on control and caffeine and the particular stubbornness of someone who equates asking for help with announcing defeat. He looked like he hadn't slept without medication in 5 months. He looked, under the jacket and the composure and the very specific way he held himself in space, like he was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't reach. She understood him. She had always understood him, which was sometimes the most inconvenient thing about loving him. "I'm not leaving tonight," she said. "I want to be clear that I'm not making a dramatic exit. I'm not built for those." She paused. "But I need you to hear me when I say that we cannot keep doing this. I cannot be the person you protect from your own life. I cannot be the version of normal you return to when the real things are handled. If you want me to be your wife—" Her phone rang. The sound was jarring, industrial, in the quiet of the room. She pulled it from her pocket with the reflex of someone who had spent 15 years in event management, conditioned to answer immediately. The screen said Northwestern Medical, Department Hematology. She looked at it. She looked at Damien. He crossed the room in 4 strides, and she handed him the phone, and he answered it, and she watched his face. She watched it go through 3 distinct expressions in 8 seconds. Attention, then something sharper, then a controlled blankness that she now recognized as the face he wore when the information was bad and he needed to keep functioning. "How long ago?" he said. A pause. "And the current count?" Another pause, longer. His jaw set. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. He ended the call. He stood very still for a moment. "Charlotte," she said. Her counts dropped again, faster than last time. He was already moving toward the door. "The protocol isn't holding. They need to—" He stopped. She could see him trying to simplify it, translate it into something transferable in the time they had, and she watched him realize there wasn't time. "I have to go." I'm coming with you. Madeline? I'm coming. She picked up her jacket from the chair. That's not a request. He looked at her for a half second. Then he moved toward the door and she followed, and neither of them said anything in the elevator or the lobby or the 40 feet between the building entrance and the car. His driver pulled away from the curb into the evening traffic, and Damien sat with his phone in his hands, calling the hematologist back, asking questions she could only half decode. Protocol adjustments, transfusion timing, something about a consultation with a specialist in Boston whose name she didn't know. She sat beside him and watched the city slide past the windows. She felt the fight they'd been having, still unfinished, still live, everything still on the table, recede to the back of the room and wait. It would come back. She knew it would come back and they would have to finish it. Navigate the specific damage of 2 months of concealment and the revelation of Renata Voss and everything that still needed to be said about trust and partnership and what she was and wasn't willing to accept from a man she'd built her future around. But right now there was a 26-year-old woman in a hospital room whose bone marrow had stopped doing what it was supposed to do. And the man sitting next to her, closed off and controlled and exhausting in his inability to let anyone carry anything with him, was the only family that woman had. She reached over and covered his hand with hers, the same way she had that first night 2 weeks ago across the kitchen counter. He turned his hand over and held on. They drove. The hematology ward at night had a different quality than during visiting hours. Quieter, more clinical, the sounds of the building more present without the human traffic to muffle them. Madeline stood outside Charlotte's room while Damien went in with the doctor, a measured-looking man in his 50s named Rains, who had nodded at Madeline with the particular neutral courtesy of someone who had been briefed that she was now part of the situation. Through the window in the door, she could see Charlotte sitting up, tablet set aside, listening to the doctor with an expression that was doing a lot of work to stay composed. She was paler than she'd been 2 weeks ago. Her hands were in her lap and very still. Damien stood at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed and his face locked into the configuration she'd spent 2 months misreading as distance. She understood it now. It wasn't distance. It was the face he made when he was holding himself together by discipline alone, because if he didn't, the thing he was holding would fall and break, and he could not allow that. He wore it the way a structural wall bears load, not by being impervious, but by not moving. The door opened and Rains came out. He looked at Madeline. "You're the fiancé," he said. "Yes." "He's told Charlotte you're here." He glanced back through the window. "She's been asking to speak with you." Madeline looked at him. "With me specifically?" "Yes." He paused, and she saw him make a decision about how much to say. "The donor search has been ongoing for 4 months. We've been through the national registry, extended to international. We've tested 6 potential candidates. None have been a sufficient match." He held her gaze. "We're running out of time and options. There is one avenue we haven't fully explored." She felt it before he finished the sentence. "Family matching," she said. "The testing is straightforward, a sample, a 24-hour analysis. The probability is not high, you're not genetically related to the patient, but the specific markers we're looking for sometimes appear across unrelated individuals. And at this stage of the search, every viable candidate matters." He paused. "She'd like to ask you herself." "I'll give you a moment." He walked down the corridor. Madeline stood outside the door. Inside the room, Damien had moved to the chair beside the bed. He was bent forward, elbows on his knees, and Charlotte was talking to him with the kind of focused directness that Madeline had registered in their first meeting as a defining trait. Even now, pale, tired, with the particular careful stillness of someone who'd been told not to exert themselves, she was the one managing the conversation. Madeline pushed open the door. Charlotte looked up immediately. Her eyes went to Madeline with an assessment that was more direct than any 26-year-old had a right to be. And then something in her face shifted, something that was not quite an ask because Charlotte Blackwood didn't quite ask. It was the expression of someone who was about to do something that cost them pride and was doing it anyway. Damien looked up. He looked at Madeline's face, then at Charlotte's, and she could see him put it together. "You heard," he said. "The doctor told me outside." Charlotte said, "You don't have to. I want to be clear about that. You don't owe me anything." Her voice was steady. "We've met twice. You didn't know I existed 3 weeks ago. I'm not asking as a— Charlotte, Madeline said. Charlotte stopped. I'll be tested tomorrow morning. She crossed the room and sat in the second chair, the one on the other side of the bed from Damien. Now tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with any of this. Because I've been hearing about your blood counts for 3 weeks, and I'd like to know who you actually are. Charlotte stared at her. Then, for the first time in Madeline's limited experience of her, Charlotte Blackwood laughed. A real one, unguarded, the kind that sneaks out before the composure can stop it. And in it Madeline could hear the shape of the woman she was when she wasn't being sick and brave and managed. Damien was looking at Madeline with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. It would come to her later, lying awake in the early hours of the following morning while he sat in the hospital waiting room refusing to go home. It was the expression of a man seeing, for the first time, the full dimension of what he'd almost lost by trying to protect it. The test results came back in 22 hours. Madeline was in the hospital cafeteria drinking terrible coffee when Rains found her. He sat down across from her with his tablet and turned it so she could see the screen, and he showed her the compatibility markers, and he explained what they meant in the precise, restrained language of a physician who has delivered enough news, good and bad, to know that the delivery matters as much as the content. She listened to all of it. When he was done, she sat with the coffee cup between her hands and looked at the table for a moment. "What are the next steps?" she said. He told her. She stood up and she walked back down the corridor toward Charlotte's room, and she was 3 steps from the door when it opened, and Damien came out and stopped when he saw her face. And she watched him read it, the same way he'd always read her, the same instant fluency that had been one of the first things she'd loved about him, and one of the things she'd been most afraid of in the last 2 months. He read her face, and he knew. She watched something move through him that she had no word for, something that started in his eyes and moved down through his whole body like a current, and for a half second, just a half second, every wall he'd ever built came completely down, and what she saw underneath was simply a man who had been terrified for 5 months and had just been handed back the thing he'd been most afraid of losing. He reached for her. She let him. He held her in the corridor of the hematology ward with the fluorescent lights overhead and the sounds of the hospital around them, and she felt him shake. Once, a single involuntary tremor that he controlled almost immediately, and she kept her arms around him and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. There was only what came next. And what came next was the question she'd been carrying since she walked out of that cafeteria, with the test results in her head. The question that had nothing to do with compatibility markers or treatment protocols. The question that was about the two of them, the specific damage that had been done, the things still unfinished on the table at home. She pulled back enough to look at him. "We are not done with our conversation," she said. "I know. This doesn't fix what happened between us." "I know that too." She looked at his face, open now, unguarded in the way he almost never allowed, the way the night in the car had been, and the way the hospital corridor was, because crisis had a way of burning off the performance and leaving the thing underneath. "Then let's go back in there," she said, "and after, when this is more stable, we sit down and we finish it, every part of it. Renata, Charlotte, the months you spent deciding what I was strong enough to know." She paused. "All of it." "All of it," he said. She turned toward the door, and then her phone buzzed, and she looked at the screen, and the name on it stopped her cold. It wasn't a contact she recognized, but the message beneath the name was 4 words, and those 4 words rearranged everything she'd believed about the last 5 months into a shape she hadn't been prepared for. The message read, "He's been lying to you about all of it. No signature, no context, just those 7 words on a screen in a hospital corridor, while Damien stood 2 feet away watching her face do the thing she'd spent 4 hours that afternoon training it not to do." She turned the phone so he couldn't see the screen and slid it into her jacket pocket. "Who was it?" he said. "Wrong number." She said it without hesitation, without a tell, and hated herself for how easily it came out. The same reflex she'd been furious at him for. The same exact mechanism, information withheld in a fraction of a second because she needed time to understand it before she handed it over. She filed that observation away somewhere cold and kept moving. "Go back in with Charlotte," she said. "I'll be in a minute. I need to make a call." He looked at her for a beat too long. Then he pushed the door open and went in. She walked 12 paces down the corridor to an alcove beside the supply room and pulled the phone back out. She looked at the message again. Unknown number, Chicago area code. Sent 4 minutes ago, which meant someone knew she was here. Not at home, not at the penthouse. Here, in this specific building on this specific evening. She typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came in under 30 seconds. Someone who knows what Renata Voss was actually paid for. Her pulse spiked. She controlled it. She typed, "Tell me." A pause. Longer this time. She stood in the alcove with the phone in both hands and counted her own heartbeats and watched the screen. Down the corridor, a nurse moved between rooms. The building breathed around her, the low mechanical hum of a facility that never fully slept. The reply arrived as an image. She opened it. It was a document, different from the financial summary she'd found in Damien's desk. This one had a different header, a different institution, and it took her a moment to parse the structure of it because her hands had gone cold and her eyes kept moving to the wrong parts of the page. She forced herself to start at the top and read down. It was a contract, not a financial summary, not a medical record. A contract, drawn up between a private legal entity she didn't recognize and an individual identified as R. Voss, dated 11 months ago, 2 months before Charlotte's diagnosis. She read the material terms twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket and stood very still with her back against the wall of the alcove and breathed through the cold that was moving up from her hands into her arms. The contract wasn't for medical assistance. It wasn't for donor testing support or travel costs or any of the narrative Damien had given her in the kitchen 2 hours ago. The contract was for information, specifically for the identification and location of a biological relative of an individual named Charlotte Park. Charlotte's name before she'd taken Blackwood informally upon making contact with Damien. Information to be sourced from private adoption records through a contact at a records firm and delivered within 60 days. Renata Voss hadn't found Charlotte through the donor search. Damien had found Renata Voss, had paid her to be found, had constructed the entire narrative of Charlotte discovering her biological mother through medical necessity. And beneath that narrative was a different one entirely, one in which the search had been deliberate, funded, and orchestrated months before Charlotte was ever diagnosed. She stood in the alcove for 90 seconds. Then she went back to Charlotte's room, pushed open the door, and said to Damien, with a voice so controlled she could hear the steel in it herself, "Can I speak to you outside?" Charlotte looked between them. She said nothing. Damien rose from the chair. In the corridor, she walked 20 feet from the door, far enough that Charlotte couldn't hear through the glass panel, and turned to face him. She didn't give him time to read the situation, to prepare, to construct. "Who hired Renata Voss?" she said. Something happened behind his eyes, the specific tightening of a man who has just had the floor pulled from beneath him and is deciding, in real time, whether to fall or grab for the wall. "Madeline? Who hired her? Before the diagnosis. 11 months ago." She pulled out her phone and held the screen toward him. The contract image, the dates, the terms. "Someone sent me this. I don't know who. I don't know why. What I know is that you told me Renata Voss came into this because Charlotte needed a donor and found her birth mother through medical records. And that is not what this document says." He looked at the screen. He didn't reach for the phone. "Who hired her?" she said again. "I did," he said. The corridor was very quiet. "Why?" He exhaled. His hands went into his jacket pockets. A containment gesture, something to do with them. "When Charlotte came to me 3 years ago, when we started building something, I ran background on her. That's what I do. That's how I operate. I run backgrounds on everyone." He paused. "In the process, I found out she'd been adopted privately. Helen Park had raised her, but there were records that indicated a biological mother was alive and locatable. I sat on that for a year. And then I watched Charlotte. I watched her manage her life without any real family foundation. Helen was gone. She had no siblings. Her connection to her own history was a blank. And I thought," he stopped. "I thought if I could find the biological mother, verify that she wasn't a liability, wasn't someone who would hurt Charlotte or destabilize what we'd built, I could give Charlotte the option. Not force it, not engineer it, just make the option available." "So you hired Voss to locate and vet Renata?" "Yes." "And then you paid Renata?" I paid Renata because she was in financial difficulty, and I needed her to be stable enough to be introduced to Charlotte without the desperation of her situation contaminating the relationship. I needed it to be clean. You needed it to be managed, Madeline said. Yes. And when Charlotte was diagnosed and Renata turned out not to be a compatible donor, the relationship between them had already started. Charlotte had already... He paused, and she could see the words costing him something. Charlotte had already told me it was the most important thing she'd found in years, meeting Renata, having a biological history to point to. I wasn't going to destroy that by telling her how it started. So you kept the contract secret? Yes. From Charlotte. From me. From everyone. She stood very still. She looked at him. This man she had chosen, this complicated and exhausting and ruthless and genuinely loving man. And she felt the whole of the last several hours rearranging itself into something she hadn't predicted. Because this wasn't a betrayal of the kind she'd been bracing for. It was something more specific and in some ways more difficult. It was a portrait of how he operated, the deep architecture of it. The way control was not a strategy for Damien, but a reflex as automatic as breathing. He had found Charlotte's birth mother and arranged the introduction and funded the stability of it, and told a version of the story that was true in its individual facts and false in its structure, and he had done it because that was simply what he did. He managed outcomes. He built the circumstances that produced the results he wanted, and then he stood back and let people believe the results had arrived naturally. You do this with everything, she said. He didn't answer. That's what I'm understanding right now. You do this with everything. Charlotte, Renata, me. Her voice was quiet and very precise. I'm not exempt from this, Damien. You manage me too. You decide what I need to know, and when I need to know it, and how it should be framed so that I arrive at the conclusion you've already chosen for me. That's not... Don't. The word came out hard. Don't tell me that's not what it is. I am standing in a hospital corridor at 9 o'clock at night with a contract image on my phone that was sent by someone who apparently knows your business better than I do, and I need you to understand something. She stepped closer. Close enough that she was looking up at him at the specific angle that meant she was not backing down. I am not a liability to be managed. I am not an outcome to be engineered. And if you fundamentally cannot treat me as a partner rather than a protected variable, then we cannot... Her phone buzzed again. She looked down. Same unknown number. The message said, ask him about the vote. Ask him what Renata's ex-husband wanted in exchange for the records access. Ask him what he agreed to give. She read it. She read it again. Then she looked up. Damien was watching the phone. His face had gone a shade more controlled than before, which told her that this message landed differently than the contract had. This one hit something specific. Renata's ex-husband, she said. The muscle in his jaw moved. What vote? What did he want? Silence. Damien. Her voice had dropped. Not quieter, lower. Different register. The voice she used when she was past the point of performing patience. We are standing in the hospital where your sister is fighting to stay alive, and I have just been told that someone connected to the arrangement you made to find Renata Voss wanted something from you in exchange. Something you agreed to give. I need you to tell me what it was. He looked down the corridor, back at her. His hands were still in his pockets. His name is Gerald Voss, Damien said. He and Renata divorced 4 years ago. He maintained a contact at the private records firm. That's how I accessed Charlotte's adoption records. He brokered the access. And what did he want? He wanted a seat at a table. Damien's voice was flat, stripped down. There's a territory arrangement, North Lakefront distribution, logistics coordination, that was being restructured last spring. Gerald Voss had previous interests in that network before they were absorbed 3 years ago. He wanted reinstatement of a portion of that arrangement. The room went very cold. You gave a criminal concession to a man, she said, so that you could secretly locate your sister's birth mother, so that you could engineer a reunion you never told Charlotte was engineered, so that she could find something beautiful that was actually a constructed set piece. She paused. And the man you gave that concession to is now sending messages to my phone. Damien said nothing. Why is he sending messages to my phone? Because he wants more, Damien said. His voice was very quiet. He's been escalating for 3 months. He wants the full reinstatement of his network position. He's been threatening to expose the contract to Charlotte if I don't comply. And you didn't comply. No. So he escalated to me. Yes, she breathed. 4 in, hold, 4 out. It didn't work this time. Her hands were shaking, a fine controlled tremor she pressed down by gripping the phone tightly. She looked at Damien and understood with absolute clarity that she was looking at the full shape of something she'd only been seeing pieces of for 4 years. Not a monster, not a villain. A man who loved the people in his life with a ferocity that expressed itself as control, whose care manifested as orchestration, who had looked at a sister he'd found late in life, and a woman he loved, and had tried to build circumstances so perfect that neither of them would ever have to feel the weight of what it had cost him to make them real, and had built, in the process, a structure with a weak point that someone else had found and was now pressing on. What does Gerald Voss want specifically? She said. Numbers. Timeline. Damien looked at her. Why? Because I'm asking. Madeline. Because whoever is sending these messages had my number, which means they've been doing some management of their own, and I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before I decide what I'm going to do. She held his gaze. And because I am done, completely, permanently, absolutely done, being the person in this relationship who operates with incomplete information. So tell me. Numbers. Timeline. What does he want? Something shifted in Damien's face. The wall came down one more increment. Not all the way. She understood he was constitutionally incapable of all the way, but enough. Enough that she could see the man behind the management, tired and cornered, and for the first time in 4 years, looking at her like he was genuinely uncertain what she would do. He told her the specific amount of network territory Gerald Voss wanted reinstated, the timeline he'd set, the leverage points he'd identified and was threatening to use. He told her in the flat, precise language of a man reciting operational facts, but his voice had a quality underneath it, an undercurrent she recognized because she'd heard it once before, in the dark of their living room at 4:17 in the morning when he'd told her his sister was sick, defeat. Managed, controlled, almost invisible. But there. He's been into Voss's communication records, Damien said. He has copies of the original contract. He has the payment history. If he delivers that to Charlotte, she finds out the reunion was bought. She finds out I bought it, that I decided she needed something and arranged it and let her believe it happened naturally. He paused. I can manage Gerald Voss. I can contain this, but it requires compliance with his terms, and his terms are unacceptable, operationally untenable. Yes. She looked at him. You've been managing this at the same time as Charlotte's illness. Yes. For 3 months. Yes. Alone. The word landed. He heard it. She watched him hear it. Damien. She said his name the way she almost never said it, not in frustration, not in love, but in the specific tone of a woman making a final statement of position. This ends tonight. Not Gerald Voss. I understand that's not a one-night problem. I mean this. She indicated the space between them. The operating alone, the managing alone, the deciding alone what I can hold. She waited. I mean it. I know you mean it. Do you believe it? He looked at her for a long moment. I'm working on it, he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in 4 years. She recognized it as such because it didn't have the shape of reassurance. It had the shape of a true answer, imperfect and unfinished, which was the only kind she trusted anymore. Her phone buzzed a third time. She looked at the screen. Same number. But this message was different. Not text, but a location pin. Followed by, meet me. 1 hour. Come alone. I'll send everything I have to Charlotte's room if you don't. She showed Damien the screen. She watched his face go through something she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled recalibration, not the managed response. Something faster and more dangerous. His eyes went cold in the specific way she'd heard described, but never witnessed directly. The stillness of a man calculating. You're not going, he said. That's not your decision. Madeline, it is not your decision. She pocketed the phone. He contacted me. He put me in this. I'm already in it. She looked at him steadily. You cannot manage this one. Do you understand? Whatever Gerald Voss thinks he knows about the leverage points in your life, he got one thing right. He found one that you cannot orchestrate around, because it involves me, and I do not get orchestrated. Damien stared at her. I'm going to call Marcus, she said. His head of security, a man she'd met a dozen times and trusted in the specific limited way you trust a person who is very good at a thing you have no ability to evaluate. I'm going to get the location checked, and then we are going to figure out how to handle Gerald Voss in a way that doesn't involve giving him what he wants, or letting Charlotte find out that the most meaningful thing that happened to her in the last 3 years was manufactured. She paused. Together. We do it together. He was looking at her with that expression she still didn't have a name for. She'd been trying to name it since the parking structure 2 weeks ago when she'd told him Charlotte was going to be okay. Why are you... He stopped. Why am I what? Why are you still... He couldn't finish it. Because I love you, she said, which I recognize is inconvenient for both of us right now, and because walking away from a problem has never once been my instinct, and you are a problem I am not finished with. She picked up her jacket from where she'd set it on the chair arm. Call Marcus. I'll be back in 2 minutes. I need to tell Charlotte we're stepping out. She pushed the door open. Charlotte was sitting up in bed with her arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had been listening to the muffled shape of an argument through a hospital door and had formed opinions about it. Is it bad? Charlotte said. Manageable, Madeline said. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now. She met Charlotte's eyes. We'll be back. Is there anything you need before we go? Charlotte looked at her for a moment. The assessment, the same one she'd deployed in the first 2 seconds of their first meeting. Then she said, Don't let him do this alone. I'm not planning to, Madeline said. Charlotte nodded. One small motion, precise and final, the Blackwood family gesture of things agreed upon. Madeline let the door close. In the corridor, Damien was on his phone, voice low, giving Marcus the location coordinates with the terse efficiency of a man who'd made this kind of call many times. He met her eyes when he finished. He put the phone in his pocket. Marcus says 20 minutes to get eyes on the location, he said. Then we wait 20 minutes. They stood side by side in the corridor, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the specific heat of him, the presence of him, in the way she always had since that first night at a fundraiser gala, when he'd stopped her near the coat check and said something true. The 20 minutes passed. Marcus called back. She watched Damien's face as he listened. She watched it shift, once, twice, a third time. Each shift smaller and more controlled than the last, the way a man absorbs intelligence that changes the operational picture and reorders his thinking on the move. He ended the call. He turned to her. His face was very still. Gerald Voss is at the location, he said. He's not alone. How many? 3. And Madeline, he paused. Marcus recognized one of them. He's connected to the Falcone network, the people who made threats 3 years ago. The name registered. She'd heard it once, in a courthouse hallway, in the context of something she'd been told not to worry about. She'd filed it away in the category of things she understood existed without needing the details. She understood she needed the details now. What does that mean? She said. It means Gerald Voss isn't freelancing, Damien said. It means someone with a longer memory and a larger grievance found him and pointed him at me. His voice was quiet. It means this was never about the network territory. It was never about Charlotte or Renata or the contract. What was it about? He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw it, the full weight of it, the thing he'd been carrying beneath everything else, beneath Charlotte and Renata and the secrets and the months of managed distance. It's about me, he said. It's always been about me. They used everything else to get to a place where I'm standing in a hospital corridor at 9:30 at night, isolated from my people, with my sister in a room behind me and the woman I love standing in front of me, and no good option for how to move. The corridor stretched away in both directions, silent, institutional, indifferent. She looked at him. He looked at her, and she understood, in the specific way that clarity arrives sometimes, not with drama, but with the flat, clean certainty of something self-evident. That the next decision they made would determine not just tonight, but everything that came after it. That they were standing at the exact point where the story of the last 4 years would either break or hold. She made the decision before he finished the thought. "Call Marcus back," she said. "Tell him we need a second team at the hospital. Charlotte doesn't move, doesn't get visitors who aren't cleared, and nobody on this floor knows why. Can he do that in the next 10 minutes? Damien was already pulling out his phone. "Yes, then do it. And then you're going to tell me everything you know about the Falcone network's current structure. Because if this is about you and not about Charlotte, then the play isn't to hide in this building and wait. The play is to move first." He stopped dialing. He looked at her. "You don't have to—" "Damien," she said it quietly. "Final. Dial." He dialed. She stood beside him in the corridor and listened to him give Marcus instructions in the low-clipped shorthand of a man who had built the language of this world out of necessity rather than preference. And she listened not just to the words, but to the structure of him. The way his mind worked when the defensive walls came down and there was only the problem and the available resources in the next 30 seconds. She had watched this from a distance for 4 years and understood it abstractly. Standing inside it was different. Standing inside it, she thought, was what she should have been doing from the beginning. Marcus called back in 8 minutes. The hospital security detail was in place. 2 men, cleared through legitimate channels, positioned outside Charlotte's ward under a cover Damien's attorney had established in under 4 phone calls. It was the kind of thing that happened when you had the right infrastructure, and Madeline filed away, not for the first time, the particular nature of the world she had chosen to live in. Then Damien told her about the Falcones. He told her in the corridor, standing in 12 minutes of compressed operational history. A network that had existed on Chicago's northwest side for 2 decades, that had made a territorial claim 3 years ago that he'd refused, that had backed down after what he described as a negotiation and what she understood to mean something more final than that. He told her that the network had restructured since then. New leadership, the old capo's nephew, a man named Vincent Falcone, who was younger and more patient than his predecessor, and had apparently spent 3 years building a lever long enough to move Damien Blackwood from a position of stability. Gerald Voss had been that lever. The connection between Voss and the Falcone network wasn't financial. It was older than that. Vincent Falcone's sister had been married to Voss for 6 years. The divorce had been ugly. Voss had come out of it with a grievance and a connection he could trade on, and he had traded on it, approaching the Falcone network with what he had: knowledge of the private contract, knowledge of Charlotte, knowledge of the structure of Damien's most private vulnerability. "He's been feeding them information for how long?" Madeline asked. "Marcus thinks 4 months, maybe 5. "So they've been watching." "Yes." "They know about the hospital. They know about Charlotte's condition." "Yes." "And tonight is—" She thought it through. "Tonight is the pressure point. They time this for when you're most exposed. Sister in crisis, resources divided, emotional state compromised." "Yes." His voice was flat. "It's a clean play." She thought about that. The cold strategic intelligence of it, finding the gap between a man's armor and his heart, and applying pressure to exactly that gap. She thought about Vincent Falcone, patient and methodical, rebuilding his network's position over 3 years while Damien had been managing Charlotte and Renata and their relationship and everything else, believing the Falcone problem was resolved. "What do they actually want?" she said. "Not Voss. Falcone. What's the end game?" "Territory," Damien said. "The North Lakefront arrangement that Gerald Voss referenced. That was the opening position. The real ask is broader. They want back into the distribution network that absorbed their operations 3 years ago. Full reinstatement. Essentially, they want the outcome of the negotiation 3 years ago reversed. And if you don't comply, they expose the contract to Charlotte. They expose the Renata arrangement. And then they escalate operationally against my infrastructure while I'm managing the fallout." He paused. "It's sequenced. The personal destabilization first, then the operational pressure. They're trying to split my attention and then hit both targets simultaneously." She nodded slowly. "So we don't let them split your attention. What does that mean in practice?" "It means we separate the 2 problems tonight." She turned to face him fully. "Charlotte doesn't find out about Renata from Gerald Voss. She finds out from you, on your timeline, in your words, before Voss has the chance to weaponize it." She held his gaze. And then Voss has nothing. The leverage is gone. Whatever he tells the Falcones, the detonator is already spent. Damien was very still. You tell her tonight, Madeline said. Right now, before we do anything else. You walk back into that room and you tell your sister the truth about how she found Renata Voss, and you let her respond however she responds, and you don't manage it. You don't frame it. You give her the actual truth, and you stand in it. The silence that followed had a weight she could feel against her sternum. And then, she continued, with that handled, we figure out Gerald Voss and the Falcone network without a gun to your head. On ground you choose. She paused. But Charlotte comes first. He looked at the door of his sister's room. She watched his face, the micro-expressions that the average person would miss, and that she'd spent 4 years learning to read without appearing to read them. The calculation, the resistance, and beneath both of those, the thing that was always underneath with Damien, the love, enormous and ungainly, that he'd never learned to carry gracefully because no one had taught him how. He crossed to the door and pushed it open. Charlotte looked up from the tablet she'd picked up while they were gone. She read his face in the same 2 seconds she'd read Madeline's face on their first meeting, and she set the tablet down without being asked. Sit down, she said. He sat. Madeline stayed near the door, not close enough to crowd the conversation, but present. Deliberately, visibly present. Damien looked at her once. She gave him nothing that could be read as direction. This was his. She was here, but this was his. He told Charlotte. He told her in the same stripped-down way he'd told Madeline, but without the defensive architecture, no framing of intent, no prepositioning of how to interpret it, just the sequence of events in the order they'd happened. The background search, the discovery of the private adoption record, the decision to locate Renata Voss, vet her, make the contact through Gerald Voss's records connection. The payment arrangement. The months between the contact being established and Charlotte's diagnosis, during which the relationship between Charlotte and Renata had already begun to grow. Charlotte listened without interrupting. Her face did not collapse. It did something more complicated and harder to watch. It went through a progression of responses that she was containing, one by one, with the specific discipline of a woman who had learned that losing control of her face was a form of losing, and who was not willing to lose. Madeline watched her hands. They started flat on the blanket, then the right one closed slowly into something near a fist, then opened again. When Damien finished, the room was quiet for long enough that the building's ambient sounds filled it. Somewhere down the ward a door closed. A monitor beeped twice. You decided I needed a mother, Charlotte said. Her voice was very level. It was the most frightening voice Madeline had heard in this entire 4-month story. Not because it was angry, but because it was accurate, precise. The voice of a woman locating the exact shape of what had been done to her. I decided you deserved the option, Damien said. That's the same thing, dressed differently. Charlotte looked at him steadily. I was 24 years old. I had built my life. I was not sitting in my apartment waiting for a brother I'd only known for a year to decide what I was missing. I know. Did you think I couldn't have found her myself? If I'd wanted to? No, I thought you were too proud to look. He paused. I was the same way. When you found me, I had the same information about our family that you had, and I never looked, because looking means admitting you need something, and neither of us... He stopped. Neither of us is good at that. The muscle in Charlotte's jaw moved. Renata didn't know, she said. When we met, she didn't know you'd arranged it. No. The arrangement was structured so she wouldn't know the source of the contact. She believed she'd been located through an independent search. So she was genuine. Yes, everything between you and Renata, everything that developed between you, that was real. I didn't manufacture her response to you. I can't do that. I found her, and I made it possible for her to be findable. What happened after was yours. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Her right hand opened and closed again on the blanket. Gerald Voss, she said. You heard. Hospital walls are not as thick as you think they are. She looked at him. He's been using this against you. Yes. For how long? 3 months. Something moved through her face. Not the controlled progression from before, but something faster and rawer. 3 months. While I've been in this bed, you've been managing that too. Yes. Damien. She said his name the way Madeline was learning to say it, not in exasperation, not in love, but in the specific register of a true statement. I'm going to be very angry with you for a very long time about this. I know. I need you to understand that the anger is not about Renata. The anger is not even about the contract. She held his gaze. The anger is about the fact that you keep deciding what I'm strong enough for. You keep treating me like something that needs to be protected from the cost of being in your life. She paused. I found you. I sat down across from you in a restaurant and I told you I wasn't asking for anything. Do you remember what you said? He was quiet for a moment. I said that might change. You said that might change. And I said I knew that, and I sat there anyway. She looked at her hands. I knew what your life was. I chose it. You don't get to make that choice again on my behalf. He said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say, and they both knew it, which was its own kind of communication. Is she safe? Charlotte asked. Renata, is she caught in this? No, Voss and Renata have had no contact since the divorce. She's not connected to the Falcone network. She's clear. Charlotte nodded, one breath. Then go handle it. He looked at her. Go handle Gerald Voss, she said. Handle the Falcones or whatever they're called. And then come back. And then we're going to have the rest of this conversation at a time when I'm not attached to an IV and you haven't been awake for 20 hours. She looked past him at Madeline. Take him. He's useless to me right now and he's wasting time he doesn't have. Madeline looked at Damien. He stood. At the door, he stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. Charlotte was already picking up her tablet. She didn't look up, but the set of her shoulders changed. Something that required interpretation. The particular language of two people who didn't share childhood but had built their own vocabulary out of necessity. Charlotte. She looked up. I'm sorry, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. I know you are. She looked back at the tablet. That's why I didn't throw anything. They left the hospital at 10:47. Marcus had located Gerald Voss at a bar on West Division. Not the location pin he'd sent, which had been a test, a monitoring point to see if Damien would arrive and how many people he'd bring. When no one showed at the pin location, Voss had moved to his regular place of operation, which Marcus had known about for a week and had been waiting for clearance to use. The ride across the city was 15 minutes. Damien sat with his phone and coordinated in the low shorthand she was becoming fluent in. She sat beside him and looked at the city. Still burning, amber and white, the same city it always was, indifferent to whatever happened inside the cars moving through it. She thought about Charlotte in the hospital room, angry and pale and alive, telling her brother to go handle it with the tone of a woman who had decided to be furious on her own terms and on her own timeline. She thought about Renata Voss, somewhere on the northern lakefront, unaware of any of this. Having built something real with a daughter she'd given up without knowing the path to her had been paid for. She thought about the 4 months of her own life that she'd spent building a case against a man who was quietly destroying himself trying to save the people he loved without letting anyone see the cost. She thought, we are all of us doing terrible things for the right reasons. And the difference between that and simply doing terrible things is very small and very important and almost impossible to see from the inside. The bar was a real bar. Not a front, not an operational space, just a dim room on a street that had seen better decades, with a jukebox that worked and a bartender who didn't ask questions. Gerald Voss was in a back booth with 2 men who were positioned like men who expected to be looked at and wanted to manage how. Marcus was already there, with 2 others positioned at the bar when Damien walked in. The geometry of the room shifted immediately. Madeline felt it, the specific redistribution of attention and threat assessment. The way every person in that room who was paying attention recalculated when Damien Blackwood walked through the door. She walked in beside him. Voss was in his 50s, thick-necked, with the weathered look of a man whose confidence had curdled over years into something that resembled it but wasn't. He looked at Damien and then at Madeline and then at Damien again, and she watched him recalibrate with less speed and less accuracy than he believed he had. Damien sat across from him. Madeline sat beside Damien. The 2 men flanking Voss stayed where they were. You didn't go to the location, Voss said. No, Damien said. Smart. Voss picked up his glass. Didn't bring an army either. Also smart. I don't need an army for this conversation. Voss looked at Madeline. She doesn't need to be here for this. She decides where she needs to be, Damien said. You should factor that in before you say anything else. Voss looked at her for another moment with the particular assessment of a man who believes women in these rooms are decorative. She let him look. She'd been letting men like him look her over in professional contexts for 15 years, and she'd learned that the most effective response was to give them nothing. No discomfort, no reaction, just the flat, even attention of a woman who is listening and cataloging and has already outthought the last 4 moves. He looked back at Damien. You know what I want, Voss said. I know what you told me you wanted, Damien said. Territorial reinstatement, network access. The position you had before the absorption. He paused. That was the opening. What does Vincent Falcone actually want? Voss went still. The name landed differently than Voss had expected. Madeline could see the adjustment, the micro-recalculation. I don't know what you're... Gerald. Damien's voice was patient in the way that very dangerous patience is, not warm, not threatening, just precise. You've been working with the Falcone network for 4 months. Vincent found you through your ex-wife's connection to the private records firm and offered you a position and a purpose in exchange for access to what you knew about the contract. That's not a question. That's what happened. So let's stop performing and tell me what Vincent Falcone sent you here to get. The 2 flanking men had not moved, but their quality of stillness had changed. Madeline noticed it. Marcus at the bar noticed it. The geometry of the room was a held breath. Voss set down his glass. He wants the full North network, not just the territory, the distribution infrastructure, the logistics contacts, He wants what I built, Damien said. He wants what used to be Falcone operation before you absorbed it. That's not the same thing. What I built is not what they had. What they had was a leaking, mismanaged network that generated conflict everywhere it touched. What I built from its components is different. Vincent Falcone wants to take credit for the labor of 3 years without doing the labor. He paused. That's not a negotiation. That's theft dressed as leverage. Voss leaned forward. You don't have a position here, Blackwood. You've got a sister in a hospital bed and a contract that'll end every good thing she's got left if I walk out of this room and make 3 phone calls. The contract, Damien said, has already been disclosed. Voss stopped. Charlotte knows. As of 40 minutes ago. My fiancé suggested I remove your detonator before this conversation, and she was right. He looked at Voss with an expression that was the absolute zero of emotion. Not cold, not angry, simply clear. You have nothing. The silence in the booth was the specific silence of a leverage calculation collapsing. Voss looked at Madeline. She met his eyes and gave him nothing. Vincent isn't going to, Voss started. Tell Vincent, Damien said, that the answer is no. Tell him the answer will always be no. Tell him that I've spent 3 years building something that doesn't have the vulnerabilities his network has. And that the reason for that is I don't make deals from fear and I don't make deals under duress. And if he wants to test the operational comparison between what he has and what I have, he is welcome to try. He stood. And tell him that the next time he puts someone in proximity to my family, my sister, or the woman I'm going to marry, the conversation we have will not take place in a bar. He straightened his jacket. We're done here, he said. Marcus will make sure you get home. He walked out. She walked beside him. She didn't look back at Voss, and she didn't look at the 2 flanking men, and she didn't alter her pace by a fraction of a step, because the walk out of a room was as much a statement as everything that happened inside it. And she understood that now, with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had been paying attention for 4 years and had finally been let all the way in. Outside, the night air was cold and smelled like rain coming in off the lake. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment before the car came around. Charlotte told you, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a man reconstructing a timeline. She didn't tell me anything I hadn't already understood, Madeline said. But yes, she confirmed the approach. He looked at her. The streetlight was at an angle that caught the lines in his face. The tiredness. The months of it. The specific worn quality of a man who had been running on the fumes of his own discipline for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to not be running. Voss will tell Falcone, she said. Yes. What does Falcone do next? Pulls back, regroups, considers whether the operational cost of a direct conflict outweighs what he wanted to gain. He paused. He's patient. He'll recalculate and find another angle. But not tonight. And not for a while. Then we have time. Yes. The car arrived. They got in. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. 10 seconds of darkness and the sound of the city moving past the windows, and felt the accumulated weight of the night settle through her body like something being set down, finally, after a very long carry. They went back to the hospital. Charlotte was asleep when they arrived, which the night nurse said had happened about 20 minutes ago. Unexpectedly, naturally, which apparently had not been easy for her in recent weeks. Damien stood outside the glass of the ward door and looked at his sister sleeping for a long moment. Madeline stood beside him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He turned from the door. "I'll stay," he said. "In the waiting room. In case she—" "I know." She touched his arm. "I'll stay with you." They sat in the waiting room for 3 hours, side by side on chairs that were not built for extended occupation, with bad coffee from the machine in the corner and the quiet of a hospital at 2 in the morning around them. They talked. Not about the Falcones, not about the operational situation, not about the things still to be resolved between them. They talked the way people who have just come through something together talk, carefully at first, then with more continuity, then with the specific ease of two people who know each other well enough to be quiet and resume without losing the thread. She told him at some point in the second hour what it had been like from her side, the 2 months of misinterpretation, the theories she'd built and dismantled and rebuilt. The night she'd followed him across the city and sat in the parking structure watching him walk into the medical center and felt the bottom give way on everything she'd thought she was certain of. He listened to all of it. He didn't explain or mitigate or redirect. He just listened. "I'm sorry," he said when she finished. "I know you are," she said. She meant it differently than Charlotte had meant it, but the shape of it was the same. 3 weeks later, Charlotte underwent the treatment procedure. Madeline had been tested as a compatible donor candidate. The markers Dr. Rains had identified had proved sufficient for the specific protocol Charlotte's case required. It was not a dramatic procedure. That was the thing no one tells you about the medical realities that look dramatic from the outside. It was careful and slow and clinical, and the outcome was not immediately known. They waited for 48 hours, then 72, and then a week. And during that week, Madeline went to work and ran events and answered emails and sat across from Charlotte in the hospital room every other evening and talked about architecture and cities and the specific bureaucratic misery of city permit applications, which Charlotte had opinions about that went on for 45 minutes and made Damien, who sat in the corner pretending to read, laugh twice. On the 9th day, Dr. Rains delivered the results. Madeline was there. She was in the room when he walked in, tablet in hand, with the specific composed expression of a physician who has learned to carry both kinds of news in the same face until the moment of delivery. She watched Charlotte's face. She watched Damien's. Rains spoke for 2 minutes. She caught the clinical terms and assembled them into meaning the way you assemble any unfamiliar language, by finding the words you know and building outward from them. The markers were responding. The procedure was working. Charlotte was going to need months of continued care and monitoring, and the word recovery carried a weight of time and effort that was different from the word cure. But the trajectory had changed. The direction had changed. The thing they'd been fighting for 5 months to prevent was, with the measured probability of a man who dealt in outcomes, not certainties, being prevented. Charlotte received the news with her hands flat on the blanket and her face doing the thing it always did. The containment, the discipline, and then the containment broke, just at the edges, the way a sealed window will show a hairline crack before it opens. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the ceiling. She breathed through it. Damien put his hand over hers on the blanket. He didn't say anything. She turned her hand over and held on. Madeline looked away toward the window, toward the city outside. She gave them the moment. She understood that some things were private not because they needed to be hidden, but because they needed space, and she had enough space in herself now to let them have it without feeling the absence. Later, in the corridor, Damien found her at the same window alcove where she'd stood 3 weeks ago reading a stranger's text message with cold hands and a calculus she hadn't finished yet. He stood beside her. Their reflections were faint in the dark glass, 2 people at the edge of a long night, looking out at a city that was already moving on to the next thing, the way cities do. "She's going to be angry with me for a long time," he said. Yes. She's also going to be here. To be angry. Yes, Madeline said. She is. He was quiet for a moment. I want to tell you something. Okay? When you said, the night at the hospital, when you said I manage you, that I decide what you can hold. He paused. You were right. It's not a strategy I developed. It's just how I'm built. It's how I learned to love people. He looked at their reflections in the glass. My whole life, caring about someone meant anticipating what would hurt them and removing it before they could feel it. I didn't know another way. She listened. I'm going to get it wrong again, he said. I want you to know that. I'm not standing here telling you I've been restructured. I'm telling you I understand what the problem is, which is different. He looked at her. And I'm telling you I want to learn the other way, if you're willing to be in proximity while I do. She turned from the window to face him. I'm going to call you on it, she said. Every time. I'm not going to make it comfortable when you shut me out. I know. And there are things we still have to finish. The conversation about trust, about Renata, about what partnership actually means when things are hard. I know that too. And Charlotte is going to need both of us, not just you. She's going to need someone who isn't you, who she can talk to about you, and that person is going to be me, and that means you don't get to be in the room for all of it. He was quiet for a moment. That's going to be difficult for me. I'm aware, she said. I'm asking you to do it anyway. The corner of his mouth moved, that almost smile she'd been cataloging for 4 years. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against his chest. Not an embrace, not a gesture of comfort exactly, but something more specific. A physical acknowledgement of what was there, the heart of him, beating steadily under all of it. He put his hand over hers. They stood like that for a moment in the window alcove of a hospital corridor at 11:30 at night, while his sister began the long work of surviving in a room behind them. The months that followed were not easy, and they were not perfect, because nothing real is either of those things. Charlotte's recovery was slow and required the complete reorganization of her professional life for 4 months. She and Madeline developed a relationship that was not reducible to future sisters-in-law or patient and donor. It was something specific to them, built from hospital room conversations and architectural arguments, and the shared experience of loving the same impossible person from different angles. Charlotte was direct and exacting, and occasionally cutting and never once predictable, and Madeline found she was suited to all 3 qualities. Damien got it wrong twice in the first 2 months. Not catastrophically, not the orchestrated concealment of the previous year, but in the smaller habitual way. A decision made without consultation, information withheld because the timing wasn't right, the old reflex firing before the new awareness could catch it. Each time she called him on it, as promised. The first time he went defensive briefly before settling. The second time he didn't. She marked the second time without ceremony, and they moved forward. Gerald Voss left Chicago in February. Where he went was not information she required. Vincent Falcone restructured his network's approach and did not, in the months that followed, find another angle sufficient to the cost of attempting it. Damien had been right about the operational calculus. She had understood he would be, and had found she was not troubled by understanding that. Renata Voss. Madeline always thought of her with her married name, the name on the document that had started the final unraveling, continued to build her relationship with Charlotte in the slow and imperfect way of 2 people without a shared history trying to construct one. Charlotte had told Renata, eventually, the truth of how the contact had been made. She'd told her in private, without Damien, and had reported to Madeline afterward that Renata had been quiet for a long time, and then had said, "Does it change that I came?" Charlotte had said no. Renata had said, "Then it doesn't change what we're building." Charlotte had considered this and decided it was sufficient. She told Madeline she thought it was sufficient. She told Damien she was still deciding. In July, on a Saturday morning when the lake was flat and silver and the summer light came horizontal through the penthouse windows, Damien made coffee he didn't burn. He had finally, after 4 years of burned coffee, learned the correct ratio, which Madeline had told him 17 times, and which he had heard, she believed, when Charlotte wrote it on a piece of paper and taped it inside the cabinet door, and brought her a cup where she sat reading at the kitchen island. He set it down beside her. She didn't look up immediately. She heard him stay, heard him not leave, which was the important thing. She looked up. He was watching her with the expression she'd finally named. Not in the hospital corridor, and not the night he'd first said, "She's my sister," but sometime in the weeks after. A quiet morning, unremarkable, when he'd looked at her across the kitchen table and she'd finally had the word for it. Gratitude. Not the performed kind, not the social reflex. The gratitude of a man who had been fully seen, not at his best, not with the management and the architecture and the careful version he presented to the world, but at the place beneath all of that, seen there and not left. "I was thinking," he said. "What were you thinking?" He crossed to the window. He stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the lake. The same lake she'd photographed at sunrise, framed above the window, the evidence of her life accumulated in the details of his. Then he turned. "I want to do it right this time," he said. "The proposal, the real one." He paused. "I asked you in a parking garage on a Tuesday night because I panicked when you said you needed time to think about something, and I thought—" He stopped. "It wasn't right. It was a management reflex dressed as a romantic gesture." She looked at him. "I want to ask you again," he said. "When Charlotte is strong enough to be there, when it means what it's supposed to mean." She was quiet for a moment. "That's the most self-aware thing you've ever said to me," she said. "I'm working on it," he said, which was what he'd said in the hospital corridor, and which she was beginning to understand was the truest thing he knew how to say. "Ask me when Charlotte can stand up for herself without holding the IV pole," she said. "Somewhere she can see the lake." He nodded. She looked back at her book. He stayed in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, drinking his correctly made coffee, looking at the city. The quiet between them was the working kind, the kind that two people share when they have agreed, without ceremony, to face whatever comes from the same side. She turned a page. Outside, the lake was flat and enormous and indifferent and present, the way it had always been, the way it would always be. There before them and after them, holding its own long story entirely without assistance, asking nothing of the people who stood at its edge and looked out and tried to understand what they were looking at. They were looking at their life. It was imperfect and difficult and real, and it was theirs. And that, in the end, was the only thing worth fighting for.